How do we apply the role of citizens in one branch of government to a corollary role in another branch of government? Uh, could be by taking some of the most solid, traditional, unquestioned roles in certain branches and applying that same sort of logic when the citizen's role is analyzed and characterized to another branch and try to find a corollary role if that exists or if it did or if it should. One way to approach that would be to say something like jury duty, an unquestioned aspect of the judicial branch where citizens come in to participate in the branch of government for a specific reason and are the ultimate arbiters of the law. They're expected to rule over issues of the most paramount importance beyond those which go to higher courts, which I'd rather see those issues decided by juries at this point, to be honest. Supreme Court, that's a different video. But so let's take that role where citizens are the authority uh, in matters of uh, disputes of law, either between citizens or between a government uh, and citizens, or citizens and the government. When things can go to the jury. Now they're ending up, the Supreme Court handles things as well, like I said. But so in that role where citizens are expected to take on a legal expertise and perform that role as the ultimate arbiters of whether or not guilt is, or what type of characterization you could give a set of circumstances. So there's a final authority on that. Uh, so in the judicial branch, you have the citizens coming in for temporary roles for specific situations that are, uh, they come in as the ultimate authority. You have uh, judges actually sentencing. So the sentencing is carried out by the judicial branch, but the ultimate authority of guilt is authority of deciding that is the citizen in the jury trial. So let's take the legislative branch and try to find a correlation there where beyond just the elected citizens that come into government, and we know how that kind of works out, where they become entrenched, and we have this logistical entrenchment to political office in America, which has been just an absolute horrendous happening, really, for the nation. Decent men used to want to get away from government and get out of it, as it is the place where you deal with all of the whiny, complaining problems of a society. Is where what the government does. So people that are politicians that don't realize that really want to be politicians out of a different motivation than service to the nation that's unpleasurable, like the founders who kind of experienced it. They were all pretty well. Those that were not power hungry to manipulate were pretty unimpressed with the quality of life they experienced during their service to the nation. So it was not something to be done to aggrandize one's quality of life by any means, as it is now. But let's get right back to applying the same sort of citizen authority uh, to the legislative branch of government. And we don't see any corollary roles. We see that instead there should be a legislative review process where there's transparency and legislation is well understood and comprehended and having been vetted and analyzed publicly by citizens who would be considered experts beyond that of uh, those in Congress who would pass the laws. Um, so we don't see the corollary uh, authority in the legislative branch for the citizens, where there is an ability to uh, sort of arbitrate legislative formation during the process, with the emphasis being on the full comprehension of the intended and unintended consequences of legislation. We've seen that's completely missing from the legislative process in America, where legislation is actually propagandized with rhetoric to the American people recently, with things such as, well, to know what's in the bill, we'll have to pass the bill and have it become law to know what it's going to do. Well, that is the absolute worst uh, use of human reasoning I could imagine, where let's take a course of action where we uh, have nothing but speculation to guide us. Uh, quality human existence and success is based on having predetermined expectations that are realistic, where you can set a course of action and have some expectations that are reasonably expected to become reality. That's what the sciences are all about. So the political sciences completely abandon this, and so what we have instead is a complete lack of transparency of the legislative process. In the executive branch, a corollary role, I believe, is actually the appointing of um, officials by the executive at the advice of the uh, party to which the elected official is a member. Um, it is a layer of separation between the entire aggregate citizen body, um, but it's still an influence that is more specialized within the society, and rightfully so, because the executive branch is supposed to be that highly uh, variable branch of the government, where the other two are intended to be steadfast, kind of concrete, continuously doing their roles, and the executive being the active, reactionary, uh, very interactive branch. It's the one that has all the agencies that take actions and does interventions and things like that. Congress doesn't actually do that. I mean, they are kind of unconstitutionally now. They do all kinds of crazy things in our government that are just absolutely wacko waste of money and waste of time and ignorant ventures off into never land of unimportant things. So they can write another grant to a university that's got billions of dollars in their endowments. So it really makes a lot of sense. Well, a lot of dollars for these. They're pretty much social parasites. They've got billions of dollars, and yet they beg for the debt dollars that are we'll have to take care of, and our children and their children are going to be dealing with the consequences. We've set a precedence for history uh, throughout the last few generations of continuously exploiting future generations. Um, I'm pretty fucking pissed off of you baby boomer cocksuckers, to be honest. Fucking pieces of shit, what you are. Self-centered, fucking wine-tastic bitch motherfuckers. But hey, some people grow up that way. Never trust children for money. Um, so let's get back to the legislative branch. And in order to have a corollary role, that it does exist in the judiciary and in the executive branch, and what I believe was intended to exist within the legislative branch. And at the time of the foundation, logistically, in information logistics, communications things, storage, analyzation, all of that, none of it had progressed. Logistics, physical logistics had not progressed to the point where you could actually take the citizen body and have it be able to participate when you had, week-long rides in carriages, and a lot of the citizens didn't have carriages that would make those week-long rides. It was just completely nonsensical to try to achieve this direct participation outside of the electoral process, and having senators' offices open and things like that for communications still happens. But anybody that's ever called or interacted with a senator probably knows that nothing's really going to happen unless it's going to aggrandize a reputation or fulfill the political ends that personality has within his group, within the sphere of influence that he's acting. If it represents something there, then action will be taken now. If it represents one of the foundational principles that have been abandoned and is negatively impacting significant portions of the American body politic, and uh, they're going to ignore it. I mean, that's reality there. So we'll see. I mean, some things are changing. We had like 3 judges that actually tried to make some rulings in order to create that proper role for the citizens to have the ultimate authority and understanding and analyzation and input and proper influence into the legislative branch. We need to institute that in the pre uh, passage of legislation. Before it passes, during the formation of it, first you have the intent, and then you actually start drafting your legislation in a way that you expect to be able to fulfill your goals. So you comprehend and understand what it is you're trying to achieve. You take great pains to understand that issue, which is lacking in our system right now. Legislation that's being passed is not intended to solve the social problems. It's intended to increase the bureaucracy and monopolization of industries in this nation. That's all it is. It's been a steady march. It's continuing on. The Trump administration has been excellent in a lot of its efforts, but uh, you know, it's like evaporating water off of the ocean. I mean, at this point, it is so big, unprecedented in history, the size and scope of the American government at the state, local, and federal level. Completely unprecedented, with an absolute abandonment of any relation to a constitutional perspective when they're performing their administrative duties as agents of the American citizen and bound to the Constitution. It's completely wacko to me. Everybody's lost their friggin' minds, it seems like. There's very few lights in this dimness that we see, this intellectual vacuum of ignorance that saturates our society. You've got a few lighthouses out there that are trying to make a difference. So the proper role would then be to have the citizens there during the formation, um, explicit intentions that you can draw direct correlations to the legislative uh, language itself, and disseminate that to your population, to have input, to have feedback. How do people actually think about this issue? And not just the issue, but how you're going about solving the issue. Whether it's in addition to the administrative state, whether it's going to be further restrictions imposed on citizens with fines and new requirements for expectations of social norms, um, whether it's going to be the removal of barriers that are in place currently for average citizens to be able to access commercial markets and to have the liberty to travel and take actions for themselves with the expectation of equality of justice under the law, which I believe is lacking at this time too. Um, so people can see that in the legislation, the intent and the direct explicit actions that the legislation does to address or to create the intended outcome, that is addressing a social issue that is pertinent for that level of government. So during that pre-phase process, you also have the citizens who should be saying, wait a minute, that's a county issue. Wait a minute, that's a town issue. Wait a minute, that's a state issue. That's a regional issue. That's a federal issue. That's a federal issue extending outside the borders. That's a federal issue as both the domestic and foreign. Um, so all of those things need to be identified, and this legislation should be very specific and not a piggyback ride aggregated out of 50 states beggars who are bankrupting this nation with their grant funding and pork barrel spending, and just rolling their head around like, we can't solve the issues, spend more money, debts don't matter, all we understand is Keynesian economics. um, which for those of you that are not really savvy about economics, you might want to go ahead and study it. Keynesian and Austrian schools and others, along with the common law. If you do the studies together, and then some modernization theory would be great. Um, to wrap your head around sort of get the see the forest, uh, instead of just the trees. It's time to take a step back, America, maybe. uh, All right, so what was I going to make the point about economics? Okay, so you study that stuff. You're unfamiliar. Um, Gosh, I guess I lost it there. Oh, there. Okay, I guess this video's done. So that we would see vast improvement to legislative effectiveness and a huge decrease to the corrupt activity and logistical entrenchment based in corruption. Instead, you'd have logistical entrenchments based on the approval of the citizens of the nation, where right now you don't see a representation of the actual will of the American citizen in the legislative activity of the Congress. And there is no way of approaching that issue effectively, as we've seen over decades and decades and decades, when the legislative activity has been to continuously increase the burdens onto the American citizens and future generations. Uh, and we're not there as citizens controlling this at all or having any perspective of it. We're simply a reactionary society at this point to whatever edicts are coming out of the Congress. And it's sad to say, but I believe one of the largest problems is the lack of competence and intelligence wise to even understand or comprehend how legislation is going to impact for those who are not nefarious. The ones that are writing this legislation for the last several decades are obviously anti-American. They obviously do not have the interests of the American citizens in mind. This is so blatant, and to ignore it is so phony. At this point, uh, it's kind of pointless to even turn on cable news or listen to the rhetoric from the majority of political personalities. If instead we could kind of just say, no, you're absurd. Here's what you should be working on. We're going to stop the healthcare industry and insurance industry from exploiting the American citizens. Um, we're going to stop you, the Congress, from sending billions and billions and billions of dollars everywhere that you fancy for your own benefits and the benefits of your associates. So that's going to stop. You will not bankrupt the future of this nation with your excesses. If we were there during the legislative creation process, and that would be a reality,